An instructor who taught for nearly 30 years was fired due to the strict COVID protocols in Minnesota, only to see them rescinded weeks later. More about his story and why he's telling it next. Russ Stewart, you were an instructor at Lake Superior College in Duluth. Good to see you, Russ. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You taught ethics, logic, and philosophy for nearly 30 years, and since the school was part of the Minnesota State system of colleges and universities, you were also a state employee in that role, dealing with the pandemic, of course, obviously chaotic, but then Minnesota's Governor Tim Walz imposes this mandatory COVID vaccination and testing policy for state employees. What did you think of that at the time, Russ?
Well, I was quite surprised by it. This is in August of 2021, and things were winding down a bit by then. There was some fear about the variants that were emerging. I think the Delta variant was the one everybody was up in arms about at that time. And yet things were really getting better, and things were seemingly returning somewhat to normal. I was going to be allowed to be in the classroom in September, face-to-face for the first time in about a year. And so I was really surprised that he issued this policy mandating the vaccine or testing. And it seemed untimely to me, but there it was.
As a teacher of ethics and logic, you refused to comply with the mandate. So what happened?
Well, the problem fundamentally was I didn't think that the governor had the legal authority to issue the mandate. The state of emergency that Minnesota had been under for a year or two was lifted before he issued the mandate. So he couldn't claim that he was making it under emergency powers. He didn't have constitutional authority to do it, and no legislative authority was ever granted either. So it's just an ad hoc policy that he made up, apparently thinking it was a good idea, even though at that time it was widely known that people who took the mRNA injection were catching COVID and becoming symptomatic, and they weren't required to undergo testing. So there was no medical reason to have the policy in place, and it was a violation of my autonomy, my medical autonomy, and my privacy to be required to undergo this testing. I mean, the governor can't just waltz in there and say, everybody has to take a pregnancy test once a week or once a month, or everybody has to take a drug test. Nobody would have ever stood for that, and yet he can say, well, everybody has to take a COVID test if you haven't taken the injection. Well, that's a violation of my medical autonomy, and it was a coercive workplace policy as well. The people who complied with the policy had to go down to the HR department and publicly enter this room and swab their nose. And the test itself was, you might think, well, a nasal swab is no big deal, but it's actually a genetic test. That's how those tests work. They are sent off to a lab, and the policy that I was supposed to agree to would allow those samples to be used in any manner that they deemed fit. So it was a gross violation of medical privacy, in my opinion.
And your exemptions were also denied, is that right?
Yes, I requested exemptions multiple times. I requested a religious exemption. I made my case every way that I could, but they just simply disregarded everything that I said. I'm reminded of the philosopher Hannah Arendt. Back in the 60s, the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was captured in South America and taken to Jerusalem to be put on trial. And he was the manager of all the deportations, both internal and external, of the Jews in Nazi Germany. Basically, a high-level bureaucrat. And Hannah Arendt, writing about his trial, coined the term the banality of evil, and didn't really think of him as a sociopathic man, but rather just as a bureaucratically motivated, very unremarkable bureaucrat. And that's what I kept thinking of throughout this process is these people were just mindless bureaucrats. They were just doing what they were told to do without any thought or reflection. Not one argument I made was rebutted. Their rebuttal was simply to say, no, you have to comply with the policy.
It seems you weren't alone in this fight, as a couple of dozen state employees were on a no-pay status at one time or another in Minnesota, according to several sources. But ultimately, you were terminated. Then, about 6 weeks later, the Walz administration quietly rescinds the policy in all of this. Take us back to that time. Did you think of taking legal action? And also, where was your union in all of this?
Well, my union threw me to the wolves. I had been a member for 30 years, and they immediately sided with the administration. You have to understand, of course, Walz came out of education. He was a teacher for many years before becoming involved in politics. And so I'm confident that he worked behind the scenes with all of Minnesota's labor unions to get them on board with this policy. And so they were simply unwilling to hear my case. I requested that they grieve the determination that I was in violation of the policy, and they refused. And it was really kind of heartbreaking. I understand there are problems with unions, and yet they're supposed to stand up for the individual members when their rights are under assault by administration, and they absolutely did not do that. So that was very disappointing. Later, after I was fired, I considered legal action. But when I talked to lawyers, the message was, well, first of all, they were kind of inundated with people wanting to make cases. And, let's face it, there were a lot of cases that probably had more merit than mine did. Nurses and doctors who were being driven out of their careers probably had priority over, a community college philosophy instructor. But in any case, what I was told is even though my case had merit, it would cost me $25,000 plus to litigate. And in the state of Minnesota, the judiciary is controlled by the same party, the Democratic Party, as the governor. And so it was clear at that time that I would not really be able to receive a fair hearing in the state of Minnesota. So I decided not to pursue litigation, although there's a part of me that wishes I would have gone that direction, because I really do believe my case has merit.
So then, do you think that politics played a role in your termination, since you were outspoken against the mandate from the start?
It's entirely possible. I would love to see the correspondence between the state administration and my college administration to see what directives my college was given, if any, or whether it was a determination made by my campus president. I don't know the answer to those questions, but I was outspoken against this policy. And at the end, given that by the time I was fired in March of 2022, things were really returning to normal. COVID numbers were dropping, hospitalizations were dropping, everything was improving, people were becoming more optimistic. And I thought maybe that the college administration would just let things float for a few more weeks until summer came, and then maybe by the fall of 22 I could return and everything would be normal. But they didn't do that. They fired me, and only a few weeks later, as you mentioned earlier, the policy was rescinded. So it really does make me wonder what all of the motives were that were at play.
You paid a financial price for all of this as well. I mean, you were not planning to retire just yet.
No, I had several more years left to my career. I would have imagined retiring somewhere around 65. I think how old was I? 57 in 2022. So that's 7 more years. And, it was a solid middle class income. And now that money is gone, I will never be remunerated for it, short of some kind of litigation in the future, which at this point I don't really anticipate. But it was definitely a hardship for me and my family.
And I understand left a lot of benefits on the table as well.
Yes, I had accrued sick time over 30 years, and I didn't use a lot of sick time during my teaching career. So I had banked quite a bit, and tens of thousands of dollars of accrued sick time was also lost.
According to several different sites. It's 31 states in all did not require state employees to get a COVID-19 vaccine. 24 states of them had Republican governors. Walz appears to be one of the very first governors in the country who mandated COVID vaccinations for state employees. In hearing about your case, what should voters remember then when it's time to vote in November?
They should remember that Tim Walz is a petty tyrant, that he is not a man of reason, that he's vindictive, and that he is a consummate party bureaucrat. He actually reminds me of some kind of Soviet-era Eastern Bloc petty tyrant, like, Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he ran Romania back during the 70s and 80s and became the dictator of Romania, not because of his excellence, but because of his mediocrity. That's what I think of when I think of Tim Walz, a mediocre man who learned how to operate within a system, gained power, only to abuse it.
Well, Russ Stewart, we certainly wish you the best. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That'll do it for this episode of Collin Reports. We'll see you next time.